The aroma of Julia's signature, rosemary-infused olive oil wafted through the massive kitchen, temporarily distracting her from the fact that she was cooking in what was essentially a culinary paradise. The professional-grade Viking range gleamed under recessed lighting, and the Carrara marble countertops seemed to stretch for miles. This wasn't just any summer job, it was the opportunity that might finally launch her career beyond the constraints of the struggling bistro where she'd been working for the past 3 years. Julia Zimmerman adjusted the heat under her pan and glanced out the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the Mediterranean coastline. The Villa Oceano was even more magnificent than the photos in the job listing had suggested, a sprawling modern masterpiece of glass and stone perched on a cliff overlooking the sea. The salary for 3 months as a private chef had been enough to make her question if there had been a typo in the offer letter. But here she was, on day 1, preparing lunch for her mysterious employer who, according to the household manager, would be arriving within the hour. "Mr. Ogilvy is very particular about punctuality," Mrs. Harrington, the stern-faced house manager, had explained during Julia's orientation that morning. "He expects lunch at precisely 1 p.m., not 1:01, not 12:59, 1 o'clock. Julia checked her watch, 12:30. Perfect timing for the sea base she was preparing. At 31, with a culinary degree and years of experience in both high-end restaurants and as a caterer, Julia had dealt with demanding clients before. But something about Ethan Ogilvy's reputation made her nervous. The shipping magnate was known for building a transportation empire from a single cargo vessel inherited from his father. Now, at 35, his fleet dominated international shipping lanes, and his net worth had several commas in it. The sound of helicopter blades chopping through the air interrupted her thoughts. She peered out the window to see a sleek black helicopter descending onto the helipad at the edge of the property. Her employer had arrived. Julia refocused on her cooking. The first impression needed to be perfect. She had practiced this dish dozens of times: Mediterranean sea base with a lemon caper sauce, roasted summer vegetables, and a light quinoa salad. Simple but elegant, highlighting the local ingredients as requested in her briefing. Footsteps echoed through the marble hallway, growing louder as they approached the kitchen. Julia straightened her chef's coat and adjusted her ponytail. "Something smells fantastic." The voice caught her off guard, warm and appreciative rather than the cold, clipped tone she had been expecting. Julia turned to find herself face to face with Ethan Ogilvy. The man standing before her was not the stern, older businessman she had imagined. Ethan was tall with broad shoulders, sun-kissed skin, and dark hair that looked windblown from the helicopter ride. His eyes were a striking blue-gray that reminded her of the sea during a storm. He wore a simple white linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up and tailored navy pants, casual but unmistakably expensive. "Mr. Ogilvy," Julia said, extending her hand. "I'm Julia Zimmerman, your chef for the summer." His handshake was firm but not overpowering. "Please call me Ethan. Mr. Ogilvy makes me feel like my father." His smile was genuine, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "And based on what I'm smelling, I made an excellent hiring decision." Julia felt her cheeks warm. "Lunch will be ready in exactly," she glanced at her watch, 23 minutes. "Perfect," Ethan said, leaning against the counter. "I've been in meetings since dawn. I'm starving." He seemed in no hurry to leave, instead watching her work with curious eyes. "Would you prefer to wait in the dining room?" Julia asked, suddenly self-conscious about her technique under his gaze. "Actually, I've always found kitchens more interesting than dining rooms," he replied. "Do you mind if I watch? I can pour myself a drink and stay out of your way." Julia hadn't expected this. Most of her wealthy clients preferred to be served rather than witness the behind-the-scenes process. "Not at all," she said, returning to her vegetables. "The bar is fully stocked." Ethan helped himself to sparkling water, not the alcohol she had expected, and settled onto a stool at the kitchen island. "So, Julia Zimmerman, your references were impressive. How did you get into cooking?" Julia tossed the vegetables in olive oil, salt, and herbs. "My grandmother was Italian." She believed food was love made visible. I spent every Sunday in her kitchen from the time I was tall enough to reach the counter on a step stool. Food is love, Ethan repeated thoughtfully. I like that. As Julia worked, she found herself relaxing despite her audience. She told him about culinary school, her first disastrous job under a temperamental French chef, and her dreams of eventually opening her own restaurant focusing on sustainable Mediterranean cuisine. Why haven't you? Ethan asked. Opened your own place, I mean. Julia arranged the vegetables on a roasting tray. The usual obstacles, capital mainly, location, the courage to take the leap. The first two can be solved, the third, he smiled, that has to come from within. When lunch was served precisely at 1 p.m. on the terrace overlooking the sea, Ethan took his first bite and closed his eyes. This is extraordinary, he said after a moment. Better than most restaurants I've been to, and I've eaten at quite a few with Michelin stars. Julia felt a surge of pride. Thank you, I'm glad it meets your expectations. Exceeds them, he corrected. I think this summer is going to be very interesting, Julia Zimmerman. The words sounded like more than just a casual observation, and Julia felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with professional pride. Over the next 2 weeks, a routine developed at Villa Oceano. Ethan would often work from home in the mornings, taking calls in his office overlooking the sea. Julia would prepare a light breakfast and lunch, then an elaborate dinner that Ethan frequently asked her to join him for. Their conversations ranged from business to books to travel, and Julia found herself looking forward to these evening meals more than she cared to admit. I have a confession, Ethan said one evening as they sat on the terrace, the sunset painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. I've never learned to cook, not even the basics. Julia looked at him in disbelief. Nothing, not even scrambled eggs, Ethan laughed. I tried once in college. The fire department was called. After that, I stuck to takeout and restaurants. That's just sad, Julia said, shaking her head. Everyone should know how to make at least a few simple dishes. Is that an offer to teach me? Ethan's eyes held a challenge. Julia hesitated. Teaching her employer to cook wasn't part of her job description. It would mean spending more time together in closer proximity than their current arrangement. But the idea was appealing in a way she didn't want to examine too closely. Why not? She finally said. We could start with something basic. Tomorrow night, Ethan's smile was boyish with excitement. It's a date. The word hung between them, laden with unintended meaning. Julia quickly changed the subject, but the atmosphere had shifted, charged with a new awareness that neither of them acknowledged. The next evening, Julia set up a cooking station with 2 cutting boards side by side. She had chosen a simple pasta dish, spaghetti aglio e olio, that required few ingredients but taught fundamental techniques. First lesson, she said as Ethan joined her in the kitchen, is mise en place. It's French for everything in its place, Ethan finished. I may not cook, but I do speak French, Julia raised an eyebrow. Impressive. Any other languages I should know about? Italian, Spanish, some Mandarin. International shipping requires international communication. He rolled up his sleeves. But enough about my boring languages. Teach me to create magic like you do. Julia demonstrated how to slice garlic thinly, chop parsley, and the proper way to cook pasta. Ethan was an attentive student, his natural confidence temporarily replaced by concentration as he mimicked her movements. Like this. He asked, his hand covering hers as she demonstrated the rocking motion with the chef's knife. His touch was warm, and Julia was suddenly very aware of how close they were standing. Yes, exactly like that, she said, her voice slightly unsteady. She stepped back, creating distance. Now try on your own. The evening progressed with laughter and a few minor cooking disasters. Ethan managed to splatter olive oil across his shirt and nearly oversalted the pasta water to the point of inedibility. But by the end, they had produced a respectable version of the classic dish. I made food, Ethan said with genuine pride as they sat down to eat. Actual edible food, Julia smiled. You did, and for a first attempt it's really good. I had an excellent teacher. Ethan raised his wine glass in a toast, to new skills and the patient people who teach them. Their glasses clinked, and Julia felt that flutter in her chest again. This was dangerous territory. Ethan was her employer, temporarily her employer, and developing feelings would only complicate what was supposed to be a straightforward professional relationship. But as they talked late into the night, the line between employer and friend began to blur. The cooking lessons continued, becoming a highlight of Julia's weeks. Ethan proved to be a quick study, graduating from pasta to risotto to more complex dishes. Their time in the kitchen was filled with conversation that grew increasingly personal. "Why shipping?" Julia asked one evening as they worked side by side preparing a bouillabaisse. "Was it just because of your father?" Ethan was silent for a moment, focused on dicing an onion with the precision she had taught him. "Partly," he admitted, "but it was more than that. I've always loved the idea of connecting the world. Goods, ideas, people movement creates possibility. My father saw ships as just a way to make money. I see them as bridges between cultures." "That's beautiful," Julia said, surprised by his philosophical take on what seemed like a purely practical business. "What about you?" Ethan asked. "Is cooking just about food for you?" Julia thought about it as she stirred the saffron into the broth. "No. It's about connection too, actually. When you cook for someone, you're giving them a part of yourself. It's intimate in a way that other art forms aren't. Your creation literally becomes part of them." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Ethan reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her cheek. The moment was broken by the timer on the oven, and Julia stepped away quickly, her heart racing. She was falling for him, and it terrified her. 1 month into her stay, Julia received a call from her former boss at the bistro. The restaurant was closing permanently, another victim of rising rents and changing neighborhood demographics. Her plans to return to her old job in the fall evaporated. Ethan found her sitting on the beach below the villa that evening, staring out at the waves. "Mrs. Harrington said you weren't feeling well," he said, sitting beside her on the sand. "What's wrong?" Julia explained about the bistro closing. "I should be looking for another job, updating my resume. But all I can think about is how much I'll miss that place. It wasn't perfect, but it was home." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "What if you didn't have to look for another job? What if you could create exactly the restaurant you've always wanted?" Julia gave him a sad smile. "That's a nice dream, but reality requires capital. Remember, I'm being serious." Ethan's expression was earnest. "I've been thinking about diversifying my investments. A restaurant with the right concept, the right chef, it could be a sound business decision." Julia stared at him. "Are you offering to invest in a restaurant for me?" "With you," Ethan corrected. "I'd be the silent partner. You'd have creative control." "Why would you do that?" Julia asked, suspicious of his motives. Ethan looked out at the sea. "Because I believe in you. And because I've never enjoyed meals as much as I have since you came here." He turned to face her. "It's not just about the food, Julia." The admission hung in the air between them. Julia felt a surge of conflicting emotions: hope, fear, desire, caution. "I can't accept that kind of offer," she said finally. "It's too much, and it blurs lines that shouldn't be blurred." "What lines?" Ethan asked softly. "You're my employer." "Is that all I am to you?" Julia couldn't bring herself to answer truthfully. "It's all you should be." Ethan's expression was unreadable in the fading light. "I respect your decision," he said after a long pause, "but the offer stands regardless of anything else that might or might not be between us." He stood and walked back toward the villa, leaving Julia alone with her thoughts and the sound of the waves. The following days were awkward. Julia maintained a professional demeanor, and Ethan respected her boundaries, taking more meals in his office and scheduling business trips that kept him away from the villa. The cooking lessons stopped. Julia tried to convince herself it was for the best. In less than 2 months, her contract would end, and she would return to her real life, a life that now had no clear direction without her job at the bistro. She told herself that Ethan's offer had been impulsive, perhaps even inappropriate. She was just the summer chef, a temporary fixture in his luxurious life, but her heart wasn't listening to her rational arguments. One evening, as Julia was experimenting with a new dessert recipe, Mrs. Harrington entered the kitchen with an envelope. "Mr. Ogilvy asked me to give you this," she said, placing it on the counter. "He's been called away on urgent business in Singapore. He'll be gone for at least a week." Julia waited until the house manager left before opening the envelope. Inside was a brief note in Ethan's distinctive handwriting. "Julia, I apologize for my abrupt departure. A situation with one of our vessels requires my personal attention. I've left something for you in the wine cellar, the unmarked door in the pantry. It's not a gift, merely information that might interest you professionally." Julia's curiosity got the better of her. She found the door to the wine cellar and descended the spiral staircase into a temperature-controlled room lined with bottles. On a table in the center sat a manila folder with her name on it. Inside were detailed business plans for a restaurant, financial projections, potential locations, even preliminary architectural drawings. The concept was exactly what she had described to Ethan during their conversations: a sustainable Mediterranean restaurant with an open kitchen and a rooftop garden. The name on the mock-up logo was Naz, a tribute to her grandmother. Attached was another note: "This isn't pressure. It's possibility. These are just ideas. You would have final say on everything. Think about it. Dreams deserve the chance to become reality." Julia sat on a stool in the wine cellar, emotions overwhelming her. The amount of thought Ethan had put into this, the way he had listened to every detail she had shared about her vision, it wasn't just about money for him. He genuinely believed in her, and she had pushed him away. The week of Ethan's absence gave Julia time to think. She reviewed the business plans carefully, making notes and revisions. The more she examined the proposal, the more she realized how viable it actually was. Ethan hadn't been making an empty gesture. He had put together a solid business plan that could work. But accepting would mean continuing a connection with Ethan, and Julia was no longer sure she could maintain professional boundaries. The truth she had been avoiding was simple. She was falling in love with him. When Ethan returned from Singapore, he looked exhausted. Julia was preparing dinner when he walked into the kitchen, his tie loosened and dark circles under his eyes. "You're back," she said, stating the obvious. "Just got in." He ran a hand through his hair. The situation was complicated. "I found the folder," Julia said, deciding to address it directly. In the wine cellar, Ethan's expression was cautious. "And it's incredible, thorough, thoughtful." She took a deep breath. "But I still can't accept it." Disappointment flickered across his face before he masked it. "May I ask why?" Julia put down her knife and faced him fully. "Because I need to know if this is just about business for you or if there's more to it." "Would it matter?" Ethan asked softly. "It would change everything." The kitchen was silent except for the gentle simmer of the sauce on the stove. Ethan moved closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Julia," he said, his voice low, "nothing about this is just business for me. From the moment you served me that first meal, something changed. It wasn't just the food, it was you, your passion, your dedication, your way of seeing the world through flavors and connections." He took her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. "I've built ships that cross oceans," he continued, "but I've never built a life with someone who matters. I think I could with you if you wanted that." Julia felt tears prick at her eyes. "I do want that, but I'm afraid." "Of what?" "Of losing myself, of becoming just an appendage to your success. I've worked so hard to build my own identity as a chef." Ethan nodded slowly. "I understand that fear. But Julia, I don't want to own your dreams. I want to help them grow alongside you, as equals." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small key. "This isn't what you think," he said with a smile. "It's to a storefront 3 blocks from the farmer's market you love. I bought the building last week. It's yours whether you want me in your life or not. Consider it an investment in a talented chef, the rest us that's separate." Julia stared at the key. "You bought a building for me." "For your restaurant," Ethan corrected. "What happens between us is up to you. I just didn't want you to make that decision based on financial concerns." "You're impossible," Julia whispered, torn between exasperation and tenderness. "Most people just send flowers." Ethan laughed. "I've never been very good at conventional romance." No, Julia agreed, stepping closer to him. But you're very good at grand gestures that make it impossible to keep pretending I'm not in love with you. The words slipped out before she could stop them, hanging in the air between them. Ethan's eyes widened. You love me. Instead of answering, Julia closed the distance between them and kissed him. His arms encircled her waist, pulling her closer as the kiss deepened, conveying everything words couldn't express. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Ethan pressed his forehead against hers. I love you too, he said. More than I thought possible after knowing someone for such a short time. 2 months isn't that short, Julia countered with a smile. It is when you're talking about forever. The rest of the summer passed in a blur of happiness. Julia accepted the key to the storefront, but insisted on a proper business agreement. She would pay Ethan back for the property over time, maintaining her independence while building their relationship on equal footing. They spent evenings designing the restaurant together and weekends exploring coastal towns for inspiration. On their last night at Villa Oceano, Julia prepared a special meal recreating the Mediterranean sea base she had served on her first day, but with new refinements that reflected everything she had learned about Ethan's tastes over the summer. This is even better than the first time, Ethan said as they dined under the stars, though I didn't think that was possible. I know you better now, Julia replied. Cooking for someone is different when you love them. After dinner, Ethan took her hand and led her to the terrace railing overlooking the moonlit sea. I have something for you, he said, suddenly seeming nervous and unusual state for him. He handed her a small velvet box. Julia's heart raced as she opened it, expecting a ring, but instead found an antique copper key. What's this? She asked, confused. It belonged to my grandmother, Ethan explained. It was the key to her first home, the place where she taught my father to cook. She always said a home isn't about the structure, it's about the love inside it. He took a deep breath. I'm not proposing not yet, that will come when we're both ready. But I wanted you to know that wherever we are, your restaurant, my office, a villa by the sea, as long as we're together, that's home to me. Julia felt tears well up. That's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever said to me. I mean every word. Ethan brushed away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. When I hired a chef for the summer, I never imagined she would cook her way into my heart. But you did, Julia Zimmerman, and I'm so grateful you did. As they kissed under the Mediterranean stars, Julia thought about her grandmother's words. Food is love made visible. But Ethan had taught her something new. Love is nourishment that sustains you long after the meal is over. 1 year later, Nana's opened its doors to rave reviews. The small restaurant with its open kitchen and rooftop garden quickly became the most sought-after reservation in the city. Julia's dream had become reality through her talent and determination, and yes, with some help from Ethan, who beamed with pride from a corner table on opening night. And 6 months after that, on a quiet Sunday morning in the restaurant kitchen, Julia taught Ethan to make her grandmother's special cinnamon rolls a family tradition. As the sweet aroma filled the air, Ethan dropped to one knee beside the marble counter where they had spent so many hours cooking together. Julia Zimmerman, he said, presenting a ring nestled in a miniature handcrafted bread basket, will you make every meal for the rest of our lives an adventure? Will you marry me? Julia laughed through happy tears. Only if you promise to do the dishes occasionally. Deal, Ethan said as he slipped the ring onto her finger. They sealed the promise with a kiss, the smell of cinnamon and yeast surrounding them, the scent of home, of love, of a future being created together, one recipe at a time.